Welcome to What That Means with Camille. In this series, Camille asks top technical experts to explain, in plain English, commonly used terms in their field. Here is Camille Morhart.
Hi, and welcome to today's episode of What That Means, Nanotechnology, Neurotechnology, and Molecular Manufacturing. Very fortunate to have with me today Allison Duettmann. She's CEO of the Foresight Institute, and in a minute, I'll let her describe to you what the vision for that institute is about. She brings together researchers, and she's also graduated summa cum laude from London School of Economics in Philosophy and Public Policy. Allison, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Can you describe what Foresight Institute does? I know it was founded quite a while ago in 86 or 87, but what is the goal?
We're one of the longest standing science and tech nonprofits is trying to advance technologies for the long-term benefit of life. And so we were founded on a long-term vision of molecular nanotechnology, but from the very early ages, it always had kind of a cacophony of other technologies in the mix, including AI, implications for longevity in biotech, brain-computer interfaces, and in general neurotechnology. It has vast implications for space technologies if we would ever actually get to advanced molecular nanotechnology and so forth. And so because it had this focus on a variety of different technologies over the years, we've taken the molecular nanotechnology angle, then also spun out individual projects that focus on the other technologies as well. And the way that we usually support projects in that space is through a series of virtual seminars in each of these categories, and then a series of in-person workshops where we bring top people in the field together to work on the long-term goals of these technologies for better futures that they usually don't have another venue to collaborate on, because that's not really what normal institutions are set out to do very much. And then we also have prizes and fellowships in these categories. I think we're trying to provide this kind of like extra space where people can collaborate on these more long-term visions of technologies and how they can actually help humanity flourish.
Benefit of life or long-term goals or helping humanity flourish, they sound really good. But I do want to ask, what do you mean by that, since you're CEO of an organization that's looking to help guide technology, impactful technology in a positive way? What is positive for you? What is beneficial for you?
That is a very big question. I've studied philosophy before, and I can safely say that within thousands of years of philosophy, people have not figured out what the good is, or at least they have not agreed on what that is. And so what we are trying to hold space for is technology development that leads to worlds that can be assessed as better by many individuals. And so we're not trying to drive down really one narrative, but we're really trying to kind of like give space where lots of different positive futures can thrive. And so where really individuals have this ability to achieve the greatest possible lives for themselves. And that also includes planetary health and well-being, because without that, we don't really have a space to be in. And so without wanting to narrow it down to one, let's say, ethical framework that we follow, we're just trying to get to futures through technologies that can be regarded as better by a variety of different entities. Maybe not only humans in the future. Right? We may have to kind of like expand our moral horizon a little bit.
Really quickly, what is a conscious creature? What would you define as making it conscious?
We all, even as a layperson, have an understanding of what, at least for us, it means to be conscious. And I think it's pretty precious. Preserving this very pedestrian notion of consciousness is, I think, something that is inspiring enough. Whether or not we can figure out all the scientific details behind it, I think we get to experience it, or at least we think we do. That's my best bet.
So let's dive in just a little bit to some of the technology that your organization focuses on. Let's start with molecular manufacturing and nanotechnology, which are a little bit interchangeable. Maybe you can just tell us what they mean, what those terms mean, and then we can have a conversation about them.
People have been arguing and debating the correct use of the term nanotechnology, because I think nanotechnology, as it is with other terms, for example, as AI, the moment that they start pulling interest into the field, many other things get rebranded as that technology as well along the way. And that's also what we've seen a little bit along the path, molecular nanotechnology. But maybe the best way to describe it is just like, imagine perhaps like for a second that it was really truly possible to build things from scratch. So that rather than kind of like taking a default resource like stone or wood and then cutting it into shape and thereby wasting much of the material in the process, imagine if you could actually build from the bottom up by assembling precisely only the types of materials necessary to build the object of desire. The question is, if resources, costs, or externalities weren't an issue, what could you build? Richard Feynman gave the speech in 1959, I think at Caltech, where he basically said, the principles of physics, as far as I can see, do not speak against the possibility of maneuvering things atom by atom. So really building with atomic precision from the bottom up. The core vision of molecular nanotechnology is really doing atomically precise manufacturing.
So what kinds of things would be built? Do they span biological and non-biological? And then how do they get built? What builds them at that level?
Eric Drexler, for example, who co-founded Foresight in 1986, he wrote this book, Engines of Creation, in which he envisioned a future that was defined by these engines of creation, these molecular machines that could really assemble from the bottom up very complex objects. And they were also helped by engines of design, and that was AI. So basically actually being able to detail this path towards achieving atomic precision through molecular engineering. The early stages involved redesigning biology's molecular machinery, for example, protein molecules, to really position reactive groups with atomic precision, and thereby turning them into these machines that are capable of constructing more complex materials. And so you build up from the bottom up, almost like 3D printing, but on a very, very tiny level. And for that very long term, you could really build a variety of different either structures or eventually even other factories that could produce new factories. I think the promise there is almost unbound to really reach this really abundant future. For example, if you just imagine devices and materials that could be designed, for example, really improve lighting efficiency, promote local power generation if you have it, and could really help us meet the energy demands that we have as a planet, which are a major big deal for the long-term future, and very sustainably. We could have, for example, new water purification methods with these very, very precise materials, and could really alleviate much of the water scarcity that we have today. We could also, for example, go into the medical domain, kind of develop new methods, new diagnostics, new personalized medicine, and new personalized therapy tools that could combat diseases, fight aging. I'm sure that some people have heard of the kind of term nanobot, of very tiny robot that could clean up the inside of your bodies and remove the things that aren't working very well and repair the bits that need repairing. And so you have a lot of individual different promising focus areas in there if you kind of go all the way sci-fi. But I think even if we talk about space technologies, it's very difficult to make progress on long-term space development exploration. But with new types of materials that could be designed to be, for example, incredibly lightweight, you could also make progress on long-term space travel in a way that is currently really beyond our imagination.
So you're envisioning something where, in conjunction with AI, for example, maybe it exists in an area where there's water scarcity, to use the example you provided, and it looks at the surrounding materials it has to work with, or the atoms that are near it, and it decides how it could then maybe construct something to create purification in that area, given the elements that are around it, versus it may create something else to purify water in a different location.
If you could just create machinery that was able to clean up the mess that we made, any kind of molecular machinery should be able to also clean up the mess that other molecular machineries have made. If you just look at biodiversity and resource crisis that we have, all of this could really be helped a lot by just being able to kind of produce better materials from the get-go that don't even cause that much of waste and externalities, but then also by cleaning up some of the mess that we, coming to the current level of civilization, have left behind.
Yeah, and some of the medical advancements, just to define it in more detail, would be something like chromosome replacement therapy. I mean, you were alluding to maybe repairing certain organs, maybe if there's tissue damage, or removing certain toxins, but you could even, I think in the longevity space, aren't we looking at something like using proteins to recreate what the DNA blueprint is telling it to create, as opposed to the sort of damaged molecules that occur over time? We're actually doing replacement therapy at the chromosomal level to sort of keep our biological, naturally deteriorating bodies repaired and free of deterioration.
One problem in longevity is that even if we make all the progress that we can make, and this field has accelerated drastically, it may still not be enough to get people currently alive over this threshold of LEV, which is longevity escape velocity. And cryonics is basically preserving your entire body or just your brain, with the hope that later on we will have the types of technologies that allow us to rethaw it. The biggest problem in cryonics is that currently most of the techniques that are being used to preserve human bodies they're incredibly toxic. And so even with vitrification methods that we currently have, we're still causing massive damage to most of the cellular structures that we have in the human body. And so molecular nanotechnology is usually very much almost a necessary condition if we want to make sure that we can A, preserve folks better, but then also B, be able to potentially go in there eventually later and repair some of the damage that current existing technologies are leaving. And so that is a very, very far out case.
And there's some criticism, I guess, in the space, but help me understand this better, that AI in conjunction with nanotechnology or molecular manufacturing can then decide what to construct and autonomously go and construct it. And it can happen at such a small scale, obviously, that we may not know it's there as humans.
You're referencing the Grey Goo scenario, I'm assuming. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's basically that you'd have these self-replicating nanomachines that could self-replicate and kind of like could eat up all the resources that we have as a human civilization, including humans and including our biosphere. And it could happen so fast because they're self-replicating that we may not have time to intervene or even notice it before it's too late. A pretty out there worry based on misunderstanding of the types of molecular nanotechnology systems that are actually being promoted by the community. But instead, what most people in the field are arguing for, and what is in fact much more pragmatic, is these nanoscale factories, where we could really control the input and where we could exactly know what we want to manufacture. Those are much easier to build, arguably, than these like free-roaming, entirely autonomous bots. This kind of like worry of a Grey Goo has really been kind of resting on this misunderstanding of what the field of nanotechnology is trying to do. And there is even a case to be made that by the time that this fear became very prevalent, it was potentially being used to redirect funding from the more ambitious goals of molecular nanotechnology to the more near-term stuff. Then obviously, like anything that sounds like a new threat is also incredibly exciting for the media. And so that definitely played a role, I think, as well. It's pretty unfortunate. We can't rule it out, but I don't see it like becoming a near-term concern anytime soon.
Especially when it gets a name like Grey Goo.
Yeah, of course. that definitely helps.
So can we talk about neurotechnology a little bit?
Sure.
I think early on I would confuse the terms nanotechnology and neurotechnology.
Yeah, well, again, it's a very, very broad field and spans all the way from neuroscience to specific devices that are currently being created. What we're focusing on, at least at Foresight, or the types of neurotechnology that we're interested in, is looking beyond what's currently available to the types of neurotechnology that could actually help us cure many of the diseases that we're really worried about, but then also allow us to expand our capabilities and potentially even have something like brain-computer interfaces that would allow us to like much better, I guess, interact with the real world that is already very computer mediated, but then also potentially eventually do things that are much more kind of like out there, such as like whole brain emulations, which obviously as a term that many people, if they do know it, probably they know it from sci-fi.
So can you describe what whole brain emulation is?
Whole brain emulation is basically a potential future state of a technology where you can really emulate an entire brain. In the wake of like concerns around these artificial intelligences that don't share our hardware, don't share our evolutionary environment in which they were able to gradually learn the values that we hold, it would be very difficult to align these AIs with human values. Because the idea is that if it was possible to emulate a human brain in a computer, and that is a very, very, very big goal, then at least we have some reason to believe that it's more easy to align those human brain emulations with our current human values than it would be for an entirely kind of like external AI. We would also have better ways to kind of like interface with AIs that we create and actually get smarter ourselves. Potentially we'd be able to kind of like run on the incredible speeds that many of the computing programs are currently running and so forth. So there has definitely been like a recent uptake in interest in the field. Nevertheless, I should also say that human brain emulations, I would say we won't get there anytime very soon. So I think without significant funding and significant interdisciplinary collaboration, it is still very much like a high-hanging fruit, let's say, within the neurotechnology space.
But it would be running on circuits, not biological material. Is that correct?
Well, so here you're getting into the kind of like long-term possibilities of having biological computing. There are a few companies and labs that are working on biological computing. Particle labs, for example, is an interesting one. One could imagine that potentially the hardware could even be biological in the future. So yeah, it's possible.
We're talking about with things like Neurolink, right? Is another kind of common reference in neurotech space and looking at stimulating the brain, stimulating brain function. reading the brain and then allowing for communication externally that wasn't possible otherwise. What kinds of things are being looked at in this space?
Caltech is working on one, and there's a few others as well. At the same time, though, I think it would be difficult to get the entire readout that you can get from the invasive ones. They just have a better reach locally. And so there are, I think, a few really interesting kind of projects currently out there. I'm assuming that in the future may even be like not necessarily a patchwork, but I'm just hoping that we can just develop also better technologies that can be more non-invasive while still being invasive. And I think that there is a lot of progress in this space, but I think we still need to work on durability. We need to work on reach, and we need to really work on readouts. I think it would be great if there was more collaboration between individual companies and what they can do currently in terms of readouts, and really like trying to have a bit more of an open access to pushing some of the progress along.
So what about this concept of reading versus writing when you're talking about brain-computer interface? I want strawberry juice right now or something, right? As opposed to grape juice or whatever. And you're able to actually read that when a person can't speak or communicate any other way. That's sort of the inside out. You're trying to understand from the outside what's happening on the inside. What about the reverse of that? What about the outside in, where you're sort of implanting information or potentially implanting thoughts? It is written about. It's not like this so far out there concept right now. So help me understand, where are we with that and what kinds of things are we able to implant?
A recent paper used generative AI models to recreate images from human brain activity that matched with what the human subjects were actually kind of like looking at in that scenario. There's like a really fantastic paper out there. It's rather terrifying if you look at the individual depictions. And then they were able to kind of like use generative AI to actually really give a pretty good understanding of what the person was actually looking at. And so it was this kind of reverse engineering. A fear for that, at least, is that this technology in the hands of the wrong people could really lead to like massive infringements on our privacy. Like I think the place where we really most have privacy in currently still is our mind. On the long run, people worry about something like mind crimes. And there's been some research at FHI that was looking at these digital minds and like the types of kind of crimes that you can intrude on minds if you actually had an ability to change thoughts, to change kind of like the environments in which they occur, and to really like kind of like, engineer experiences for people is, I think, pretty massive, because at the end, kind of like the mind is the filter through which we perceive everything else in the world. And if one tinkers with that filter, I think it's that is probably kind of like one of the worst crimes.
We used to say data is the new oil, but at this point, we've got the data. We have a lot of data, and AI is working hard on the ability to be able to process that data and then generate predictions and insights from that data. One of the things we have a lot of data on is biological data that people, myself included, provide willingly for the benefit of a dashboard back to myself on how well I'm doing. And I know that there's data anonymization and other techniques to separate my personal identity from the biological data that I'm submitting. But a lot of that data ends up in the cloud. And there's really only, I can count on my two hands sort of the number of hyperscaler clouds that probably contain vast quantities of information on human biometric data. So I don't know that I have a great question to formulate. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, when at the same time we're approaching things like molecular manufacturing and we're approaching things like neurotechnology.
I think that part of the reason why Foresight has so many different focus areas, including biotechnology, molecular nanotechnology, decentralized computing, space, neurotech, is because we think that progress will occur at the intersection. And I think we see that a lot right now, at least in terms of potential, in this longevity space that you just mentioned. There has been an incredible progress recently in the field of decentralized privacy preserving machine learning. And there's wonderful work at OpenMind. And we had a fellow, Georges Cases, who was looking at privacy preserving machine learning for kind of like medical and health data. There is such a big opportunity for kind of like us to learn from the type of data that is the most sensitive to us. And there's usually financial data or healthcare data. But at the same time, it also has crazy privacy restrictions for good reasons, because it is extremely sensitive and could also expose our family if not dealt with correctly. But we do see in the computing realm now a lot of really wonderful tools, like these privacy preserving machine learning tools, that could really be used to leverage these kind of like data sinks. And so you could imagine, for example, like encrypting the data at the source and only kind of like letting metadata through that is still significant enough for specific machine learning algorithms to make sense of and to kind of give you back useful information. And so without you necessarily having to share their private data out, it is definitely, people are making progress on this. It's still cost ineffective as compared to large normal algorithmic approaches. But the problem is that usually these more decentralized privacy preserving machine learning approaches don't really have a chance go against the existing big data trained AI models. But in a space like healthcare, where we literally cannot share our data, they have a comparative advantage because they're the only ones who can actually properly kind of like make use of this data. And so I think it's a really exciting space to be looking at.
What about the problem where we have data from a vast swath of humanity on exactly how our biology functions that's now sitting in the hands of essentially the few, these sort of giant clouds that can actually hold the literal quantity, sheer quantity of data that exists on this front? So who has access to that data? Because I know you work on having the benefits not only rest in the hands of the few. So how do we tackle that kind of thing?
Well, for many of the type of healthcare data, actually, we have pretty strict regulations on this. And that's also the kind of data that would be very useful for us to actually make progress on longevity, because many of the things that people currently are doing, if we were able to kind of like cross-compare across what different people are already doing, really make big progress. So like, I think that, yes, in general, we have lots of our data in the cloud, but in specific healthcare kind of like fields that are like really sensitive, we don't.
But what about like Fitbit and watch data and, Garmin, Apple, all that stuff? I mean, that's all going to a cloud.
We can talk about kind of the risks associated with that. But I think if we want to talk about new types of opportunities that could be unlocked, if we actually were able to share relatively sensitive data, or like not share it, but actually have it homomorphically encrypted, user-friendship privacy, federated learning, all of these approaches that are currently being explored, I think we could be doing much more than we currently do with our data. We are already arguably sharing way too much. And I think if we made progress by funding a few of these more privacy-preserving solutions, because they're not far out from being actually applicable, then I think we could really take everything home again. We wouldn't really have a need anymore to share everything to the cloud. Cryptography, unfortunately, is still a really underfunded field. It's still mostly being practiced in academia. There's a few individual labs and so forth. But I think with more investment in these spaces, we would have really amazing tools at hand to actually be making progress on this. And I should say that this not only holds for longevity, but the type of kind of like promise that we see in privacy preserving machine learning technologies, cryptography technologies, security technologies, and auxiliary approaches, they would also hold for AI. If we're worried about centralized AIs becoming too powerful by having access to this big data, then I think we should be focusing much more on these decentralizing solutions that come out of the security and cryptography space, because they have an ability to allow us to make sense of the data and allow individual kind of like organizations to collaborate and actually reap the benefits of the data without actually sharing it around. And so we could perhaps compensate a bit for the normally centralizing dynamics that exist in AI.
Oh, that's an interesting perspective. So disseminate it more so that we have broader access to it and therefore sort of diminish that centralized potential power that could exist.
It all relies on cryptography technologies. They need a lot of love these days.
Just so people know, we did do a podcast on homomorphic encryption and also on data anonymization. So we talked with some technical experts who are working on those things if people want to get a little bit more. And I think the data anonymization one talks about differential privacy as well. So I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Never miss an episode of What That Means with Camille by following us here on YouTube, or search for InTechnology wherever you get your podcasts.
The views and opinions expressed are those of the guests and author and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Intel Corporation.